colleagues from the five Delta counties. And I don't know, do we have a number now? How many folks, Natasha, that are joining us? Probably 150?
So far, we have 35 joined, but we imagine that many more will join us.
Okay, well, good. We'll welcome you as you come on, but we do want to get started. Again, as I said, we have a very full agenda and a good program, and we're going to try to keep this on time. Before we get started, I did want to make just a few housekeeping announcements. This entire meeting is being recorded and will be made available online after we've concluded at www.savingthedelta.net. We're also going to try to take some questions today, assuming time allows it. And if you're attending virtually, we would ask that you pose your question and then use the chat or the Q&A features on the Zoom. If you're attending in person, which we do have some folks here this morning, please see some of the staff members that are here. They have cards that you can fill out, and we'll try to get those questions to the panelists as well. We would also hope to get to your questions, but if we don't, we would just note that we will respond to your questions and post them in the Q&A at the website I mentioned a minute ago, the savingthedelta.net. We're going to go right into the presentation just a moment, but I wanted to note that I learned yesterday, and I'm sure others have heard, that a longtime environmentalist and someone who was very, very instrumental in water policy development, certainly throughout the state and certainly in this region. I know on many occasions went to hearings and was a part of discussions that related to the health of the Delta, but certainly to water policy in the state, and that was Jonas Minton. And Mr. Minton was a good friend to certainly, I'm sure, many up here at the dais, but to many in the audience as well. And so before we start, if we could just take a brief moment of silence in his memory here this morning. And thank you for that. Okay, so jumping right into our program, I know we have speakers who have time constraints, and so with that, I'm going to ask, just before we go to our panelists, to ask the panel up here to introduce themselves, and then we'll go to our first speaker. So starting to my right with Mr. Herrick, go ahead. Just push that button in green.
Thank you. I'm John Herrick, Council and Manager of South Delta Water Agency.
Morning, John.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jeff Michael. I'm Professor of Public Policy, Director of Public Policy Programs at University of Pacific, McGeorge School of Law.
Good morning, Mitch Mashburn, Supervisor, Solano County, 5th District.
Good morning, Kathy Miller, Supervisor from San Joaquin County, representing the 2nd District.
Chuck Wynn, San Joaquin County Supervisor, representing the 4th District and the current chair.
Good morning, everybody. Oscar Villegas, Yolo County Supervisor, representing District 1.
Good morning. I'm Karen Mitchoff, Chair of the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors, and I represent District 4.
Good morning. Russ Van Lobensel. I'm a North Delta farmer.
Good morning, I'm Kelly Tabor. I'm outside counsel to Sacramento County and also the city of Stockton, and we represent the county and other Delta parties on water quality CEQA issues.
Good morning, my name is Ryan Hernandez and I work for Contra Costa County. I manage the county's water agency. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm Don Natoli. I'm a member of the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, representing District 5, and currently serving as chair of the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors. We have 2 panelists on Zoom, so I asked them to introduce themselves. We're going to go to them in just a minute. So, Barbara, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Barbara Berrigan, Perea, Restore the Delta.
Great. Good morning, Barbara. And I think we have Lenore. Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
I'm Lenora Clark. I'm a resident of Discovery Bay and serve on the Board of Recreational Boaters of California and Save the Delta Alliance.
Great. And then I think we have Diane Burgess, also from Contra Costa County. Diane?
Good morning, everyone. Diane Burgess from Contra Costa County, representing District 3 and a resident of the.
Very good. Okay, well, again, thank you to all of our panelists and colleagues. Just by way of a quick note, the Delta Counties Coalition is constituted of the counties of Contra Costa, Sacramento, San Joaquin, Solano, and Yolo counties. And we've worked together now for well over a dozen years on matters certainly important to the people of the counties we represent, which is over 4 million people in the 5 counties, but certainly have focused on issues related to the Delta. So before we go to our first panelist, we do have a brief video that's going to introduce the topic, and we're going to go ahead and play that, and then we'll go to our first panelist this morning, who is Barbara Berrigan-Perilla. So just a moment, Barbara, and we're going to play the video. So
that's fine.
Right?
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
People are looking for ways to improve the reliability of California's water supplies. Only a few years ago, a series of extreme storms caused massive flooding and drove cities and counties across California into states of emergency. Since then, the state and nation experienced extreme fluctuations in weather due to climate change, which has sadly become the new normal. These severe weather conditions, including years of massive floods or extreme water shortages, present urgent challenges in California. Increased wildfire activity, diminished high-quality water for agricultural production, degraded habitat for fish and wildlife species, threat of salt water, contaminating freshwater supplies, and additional water scarcity will occur for years to come if these conditions persist as predicted.
California's water supplies are highly variable, and water management is critical to addressing issues related to climate change. State leaders have known for decades that climate change would have a lasting and permanent impact on California's water supplies. These persistent periods of drought and floods demonstrate that long-term solutions are needed to better manage our water, to replenish our depleted waterways, to protect our habitats, and to sustain our fragile ecosystems. So why aren't we ready?
Instead of addressing our water supply, how to grow it and how to store it, the state has focused its vast resources on trying to build a giant tunnel under the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which would deprive the Delta of needed freshwater flows. Yet a tunnel won't add water to our supply, won't replenish groundwater, and would irreparably damage the Delta's environment and ecosystem. And construction of such a massive underground tunnel will destroy the Delta's economy and communities. As businesses, farms, and communities throughout the state seek reliable water supplies, California needs sustainable, unifying, and cost-effective solutions, not a massive multi-billion-dollar tunnel that won't add a single drop of new water to our depleted system. Planning for periods of drought and deluge should be part of responsible water management in California.
Local communities around the state are already investing in projects like conservation, stormwater capture, desalination, and groundwater recharge that will actually increase our water supply. In addition to local investment, action must be taken at the state and federal levels to improve our aging water infrastructure to realize a more reliable and resilient water supply for our residents now and into the future.
But to make a real difference, we need more of these projects and on a much larger scale. And that takes money. Money that is currently being wasted on a controversial, expensive, and infeasible tunnel project that creates no new water, doesn't help in droughts, harms Delta communities and the environment, is a high-risk, high-cost project, and takes resources away from other water infrastructure needs.
It often takes 10 years or longer to realize the benefits of investments into more resilient and reliable water supplies. The state needs to change its focus from a tunnel that won't create any new water and would destroy the Delta, and instead take more productive actions now. The state should concentrate efforts on projects that will secure resilient, equitable, long-term water supplies while preserving natural resources for future generations.
We would be much better off if the state focused its efforts on completing levee improvements above and below ground storage and additional water projects to conserve, reclaim, reuse, and preserve water throughout California. using money already approved by the voters. These actions could add nearly 10 million acre-feet of water to our system each year. And the sooner we take action, the sooner we will reap the benefits of improved flood protection, recharged aquifers, and additional water to help weather the next inevitable drought or downpour.
California can't afford tunnel vision that sacrifices the Delta's environment and communities. Let's work together on a portfolio approach to fix our existing infrastructure first, so that a new Delta tunnel proposal is no longer needed. We urge the state and all stakeholders to reconsider the options, to provide for current and future statewide water needs, and to select cost-effective options that also protect the Delta's unique and irreplaceable resources.
Well, thank you. And that kind of sets the tone then for the speakers that we're going to hear from here. And we're going to go right into our program and hear from our first presenter on environmental justice considerations. And Barbara Berrigan-Parilla, who with Restore the Delta, is on via Zoom. And so, Barbara, we're going to turn to you.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for your forbearance and working with our schedule. Unfortunately, Restore the Delta was broken into and severely vandalized this week, and there is so much structural damage to the building that we are in with our water quality testing programming running that we are scrambling at the moment to figure out where we're going to move our program to keep our interns safe. Supervisor Natoli, I also want to thank you for your recognition of Jonas Mitten this morning. Jonas Mitten is the reason why I'm sitting here and talking to you today. He recruited me for Restore the Delta, and he was one of a half a dozen people who envisioned what our campaign would be. The video you just showed is terrific. It covers a lot of important items, and I'm here today to share with you and talk for a few minutes about environmental justice considerations as they relate to the tunnel. And I would like to invite this group and pretty much everyone in attendance for some tours of environmental justice communities in the Delta to develop a real full understanding of environmental justice conditions and kind of what we mean by the words that we're going to talk about today. Environmental justice is not a woke term that people use in contemporary language to take on social issues. It is a legal definition that was created in the 1990s. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. And that is kind of where we have shifted our campaign. And I look forward to a future presentation where you can actually meet our young staff that is from the Delta's environmental justice community, from Hood all the way down to Mountain House, so that you can hear from them how projects and conditions are impacting their lives directly. In the Delta, we have significant environmental justice communities within our urban area that will be impacted by the tunnel, and of course, the small towns in the North Delta. And the way these communities are measured, you can use a couple tools. You could look at Kel environmental screens, and you could look by census tract and zip code to get an idea of the indicators in the populations. But what they measure when they statistically analyze what an environmental justice community is, so they look at the number of people who are from communities of color. They look at the number of people who are economically disadvantaged. They look at the number of non-English speakers. They look at the number of unhoused people. They look at the number of low-income seniors. They look at the number of people who live in food deserts. They look at the number of people who have low attainment and education levels. And so we have rural pockets of environmental justice communities that are at stake to lose everything with the construction of the tunnel. In Hood, you have a majority population that is actually Native American and Hispanic that moved to the area during World War II. They are ground zero for the intake of the tunnels. You have in Clarksburg, Cortland, Walnut Grove, 52% of those communities, their first language is Spanish. They are farm workers that live side by side with the landowners in the North Delta. Yet you don't see them involved in a lot of water processes or decision making. But if you remember from the last EIR, the condition to describe what would happen to North Delta tunnels is that they would end up in a state of blight. And people who live in the housing tied to those farms have been there for generations. They've made good livings. They have sent their kids off to college. But these are people who are at stake of not only losing their job with tunnel construction, but their home and their water supply. And yet, how to manage for those impacts, we have not seen successfully contemplated. It will be interesting to see what comes up in the EIR. There were a number of surveys done by Ag Innovations to try to survey the environmental justice community. But we will also argue that, and we're glad that was done because last time it wasn't even statistically measured correctly. But there is a big difference between measuring a community, understanding with a community, and mitigating the environmental burdens and impacts that are placed on a community. Antioch's population is about 56% an environmental justice community. And we were updating statistics from Cal Enviro screens. It looks like there's almost a 60 or 70% air pollution burden in Antioch, or air and water pollution problem. So it's a significant community. It's the environmental justice community in West Sacramento measures out at just under 50%. And then statistically, the environmental justice community with the biggest population is Stockton, which will also see a great deal of the impacts, as will the small Delta towns. Percentage-wise, Stockton, California is the largest environmental justice community in California. It encompasses about 100,000 residents. And this community lives between the bottom 80 to 99 percentile for all environmental health indicators. The areas where we are presently seeing harmful algal blooms in large numbers, even though they haven't quite come out this year because of hasn't been quite as hot. Maybe now they'll start appearing. Those communities have the fourth highest rate of asthma in the United States. And the problem now is that water quality is becoming an air pollution problem. Cyanobacteria that is part of harmful algal blooms has been proven to attach itself or generate particulate matter 2.5, which we have an abundance of near the Port of Stockton. So there's serious health problems with this. The prevailing winds from the Delta move from the northwest into the southeast, so it blows right into our environmental justice communities. What we could never get an answer when we participated in the steering committee or the stakeholder committee for the Design Construction Authority. And I ended up resigning at the penultimate meeting. We could never get answers to key questions to protect our environmental justice community around what was the real strategy for mitigating air pollution from construction of the tunnels. With the rolling out of 40,000 trucks, yes, they were trying to reduce truck trips, and they were trying to be creative. But when we went to ask for questions and data around monitoring how they were going to measure air quality standards, they were using 5-year-old data. They wouldn't commit to updating it. And so we didn't find that the walk was matching the talk. And at that time, we found that most of that problem really existed with the Department of Water Resources. Likewise, during the entire process, we kept asking for their plan for ensuring that water quality wasn't further damaged by the tunnel. As far as I'm concerned, water quality has to be significantly improved. So the idea that we're just going to remain the same, frankly, is a non-starter, especially when we had 46 incidents of HABs last year that exceeded public health values of 200%. Why is this significant? Because those cyanotoxins can kill a preschooler, they kill animals, they could show up in irrigation water, they could contaminate drinking water supplies, and now we know that they become airborne. We will be collecting data this year with the University of North Carolina, which is arriving Monday, to help us establish this link between air and water quality further for the state. Our third area, I think, so we couldn't get answers to water quality issues around how they were going to mitigate for HABs in their management of the tunnel, or how they were really going to handle the salinity encroachment issue. We are going to have challenges with salinity encroachment without the tunnel in California due to climate change. And we're going to have to work at solutions because of sea level rise, because of what water looks like, because of what the water conditions are going to be from the San Joaquin. So that has to be dealt with to begin with. But we could not get solid answers as to what the impacts would be by moving the intakes and really, to at least on the State Water Project side, eliminating pumping in the Clifton Court area. We like to remind everyone that while protecting water supply for others is important in a difficult world and changing circumstances, that does not mean that you can forget equity in the communities that are tied to the watersheds. And that's upstream for us, the tribes that are dependent on salmon fisheries, and for our own communities. The reason we focus on environmental justice communities first isn't to exclude other people. It's because you have to start at the basics. You have to protect environmental conditions for the most vulnerable people first, because if you could solve that problem, it spreads out and up. You solve problems for everybody. And so that is why we have worked so hard to try to get people to engage in the process, to force the state to start considering environmental justice impacts. We work and serve on state committees with the DSC and the State Water Board around these issues. And we're going to continue to, really make it clear that this is not going to protect our communities. And in our minds, that right off the bat violates the Delta Reform Act. I see one question here about cement batch plants. Yes, the cement batch plants are going to be located, we believe, near our disadvantaged communities in Stockton, which of course furthers the air pollution. And even if we switch to barges and train traffic, we already have significant problems near the port. They're going to be increasing port size as it is. And we aren't moving fast enough electrifying things. They want to start this project before California really moves to electrification of its ports and its transportation systems. So I don't want to see another generation of kids that live in our community sacrificed to very poor air quality conditions and permanent health conditions, especially when we've had colleagues over the last 5 years who have died from asthma attacks that have grown up in Stockton. So I think I'm going to leave it there. I probably went too long. I apologize. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I really wish we could do a deeper dive somewhere in the near future about current conditions and operations for these same communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Really appreciate you weighing in, and certainly for your long time efforts, and certainly that of the Restore the Delta. And I know you do have other commitments this morning, but we will be taking questions, and you got to at least one of those that we received in the chat. So thank you for addressing that. with that, then, with our thanks to Restore the Delta and Barbara, we're going to move to a tunnel overview. Some of that was covered on the video, and obviously Barbara has touched on a number of points. And then we're going to come back to our panel on tunnel impacts. And so with that, I'm going to go to Ryan Hernandez and Kelly Tabor, who introduced themselves earlier, and they're going to give us a bit of an overview and fill in some of the blanks. Good morning.
Thanks, Supervisor. Again, my name is Ryan Hernandez, and I manage the Contra Costa County Water Agency. So we're going to jump right into it. So let's see if this works. Great. The presentation outline, we're going to talk to you about what the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is, why it's important. We're going to give you an overview of the tunnel, kind of taking a step back to describe to you what this massive infrastructure is all about. And then we're going to talk to you a little bit more about river flows. And so when we get to slide, perfect. This is the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, and it is a natural, national heritage area. So the Delta covers about 738,000 acres and 5 counties. It lies at the junction of the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River, the 2 largest rivers in California. It is California's most crucial water and ecological resource. It's the largest freshwater estuary on the west coast of the Americas, providing important habitat for birds on the Pacific Flyway and for fish that live or pass through the Delta. Taking a step back, historically, the bounty of the vast wetlands here in the Delta allowed population densities of the indigenous people is thought to be second highest in North America. If you fast forward to the California Gold Rush, that's what brought all of the people here. And then in the late 19th century, there was a massive reclamation that turned the marshland into farmland, and it included the development of unique communities and cultural centers. And then finally, the 20th century brought the development of the large-scale Central Valley Water Project and the State Water Project, which are the infrastructure that provides Delta water to irrigate the farms that are in the Central Valley and get water to the Bay and all the way down to Southern California. And yet, the Delta is a rural place. There's fish, birds, there's times of freshwater that's full of freshwater. It's described as an engineering marvel, but we must recognize it's an important ecosystem with historic towns, scenic roads, farm stands, and ample opportunities to recreate, like boating, fishing, birding, biking. The Delta is so important that it was recognized as a Delta National Heritage back in 2009. And we have to thank Congressman Garamendi and Senator Feinstein for their work on making sure that this passed through Congress. The National Heritage Area is designated by Congress for places where natural, cultural, historical, and recreational resources combine to form a cohesive, nationally important landscape. And for now, this is the only one in California. The Delta is an evolving place. We hear that a lot. It's in the Stewardship Council's Delta Plan. And we're here today to talk about how to protect it and how to protect it from the negative impacts of the tunnel. Next slide. So what is the tunnel? This is the state's most recent version of a massive water infrastructure project. You may recognize it from different names. The California Water Fix was the last name, but it goes all the way back to the Peripheral Canal and even earlier, back when the State Water Project was developed. And what is it exactly? It is an isolated conveyance, and that's a technical term. But what that really means is that they're going to capture Sacramento River water up where Hood and Cortland is, and they're going to divert that freshwater flow around the Delta. And so it doesn't have an opportunity to go through the delta. So they're going to direct it around the delta, bypassing the delta and the ecosystem and all the folks that live here and use that, and to the export pumps. And so by diverting the water and the flows around the delta, it's going to negatively impact our water quality and the folks that live in and around the delta. Next slide. And so here on the slide, you can see that we are talking about, we expect that the EIR that is going to be coming out, the latest version of the environmental impact report, is going to have alternative routes, and you can sort of see them on the screen right here. And so the two intakes are in Hood and Cortland. And so these intakes are about a quarter mile long. And so when you try to think about what a quarter mile is, you know, that's 1,300 feet. That's once around a track, a football track. The Salesforce Tower is about 1,000 feet tall. And so you can imagine laying the Salesforce Tower down on its side, it's going to be even longer than that. And so, you know, one of the hardest things to do is to have a presentation and describe to folks that are watching the scale of this project. It is just massive. And so, you know, this is going to be a 40-mile approximately tunnel that's buried 150 feet below the delta, and it's going to be 40 feet in diameter. And so 40 feet in diameter, what does that mean? If you can imagine a full-size school bus, you know, that's about 40 feet. And so that's going to be buried below the delta, and water will be traveling through there. It's expected to terminate, the end of the tunnel will be down near the export pumps. Next slide, please. And so you can see that I've highlighted the yellow arrows. Although there are several route locations and alternatives, we are looking specifically at the preferred alternative that we expect from DWR. And so that will be following the yellow arrows. Again, the intakes at Hood and Cortland, they are 3,000 cubic foot per second intakes. And what is 3,000 cubic feet per second, and how big is that? So 1 foot per second, kind of imagine a basketball, right? And so if you have 3,000 basketballs traveling by you at per second, that is over a quarter mile long, that's kind of the size of this one particular intake, and you've got to times that by 2. So, you know, we're talking about the scale. And if this isn't clear, I would invite folks to reach out to us and we can take you out there. We can show you around. So 14 years of construction, 24 hours a day. You know, I read in a recent article, it's about 2 to 6 years for permitting. You talk about 14 years of construction. We're up over 20 years before, you know, something like this could happen. And so to talk about heavy truck trips on I-5, yeah, there's going to be lots of trucks. Next slide, please. And so here's the southern part of and the yellow arrows. Again, the preferred alternative, as we understand it, is called the Bethany Alignment, the Bethany alternative. You know, and it doesn't provide any local benefits. You know, the tunnel is strictly to secure high quality water for exports. We talk about cost, $16 billion. That's estimated in 2020 dollars. And it doesn't count for the inflation and the increasing in construction costs that we're seeing right now. Next slide. And again, this is just to show you the scale. So if you can, in the center of the slide, this is a tunnel boring machine. This will be, again, below the delta, 150 feet. There's a person standing there. That's actually to scale. There's a lot of information on here. I'm sure that the presentation will be available after the slide, so you can read up on that. Next slide, please. And so let's just quickly talk about the tunnel, reusable tunnel material. I think a better name is tunnel muck. There is no plan to actually reuse this tunnel material. It's going to be, you know, piled 15 feet high in 123 acre and more and less all over the Delta, just fundamentally changing the look and the feel of the Delta over the life of what's to come. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm Kelly Tabor, and I'm going to provide just a quick high-level overview of some of the key impacts associated with the tunnel. And then after our presentation, we'll be handing it over to our subject matter experts who will give you a much deeper dive into the economic, water quality, agricultural, and recreational effects that we expect to see from this project. From the video that was shown and Ryan's remarks so far, you see that the Delta is the critical juncture for our water supply system in California. This slide illustrates a little bit about how the system works. The Delta drains a watershed that totals about 40% of California's freshwater supply. Federal, state, and local reservoirs store some of that water for flood protection, water supply, environmental uses. You can see that a very small amount of the water that goes through the Delta is actually used in the Delta. A whole lot of it is pumped out of the Delta for use south in cities and farms in the Bay Area and Central Valley and Southern California. Critically, enough fresh water has to flow through the Delta during dry months to repel salt water that's pushing inland from the ocean in San Francisco Bay. The state and federal water projects use reservoirs to help control that salinity from reaching into the Delta. But during drought conditions, there just simply isn't enough water in these upstream reservoirs to push the salt water back. And it can contaminate the water supply, both for Delta residents and also for the state and federal water projects. And that, of course, is a key factor behind the decision to move forward with the Delta Tunnel, is protecting water quality for the exporters. As we've mentioned, as we'll hear further today, the Delta Tunnel doesn't do anything to help protect the Delta from the effects of sea level rise. The Department of Water Resources and the Delta Tunnel proponents have basically said, pull up the ladder, I'm aboard, we're gonna solve the problems of climate change for water users outside the Delta, and Delta folks, you're gonna be on your own. Next slide, please. As we've discussed, the Delta is a common resource. It's the freshwater supply for people in the Delta and people south of the Delta. I think the Delta County's position is that the state Department of Water Resources has an obligation to protect that water supply and that resource for the entire state and for the environment, and not just for the water exporters. The Delta exports have been shown since the start of the state and federal water projects to disproportionately impact the environment and fish and wildlife, because the flows are just so negligible that the estuary doesn't function as it should anymore. But the tunnel, as we've mentioned, provides no incentive to help solve the water quality problems or to strengthen levees in the Delta. Next slide, please. The tunnels will have just absolutely devastating impacts to the communities in and around the Delta during the construction period. And those construction period has been estimated to last 10 or more, up to 14 years. And we know this, even though the environmental impact report isn't out, because we've seen one report. It wasn't very good, but it did tell us enough to know, and common sense tells you that this is going to be bad. There's going to be air quality, noise, road traffic, emergency access problems. Communities and businesses will be disrupted. And I'll just say here, why should people who live outside the Delta care about this? I live in the Delta. I grew up in the Delta. I jumped off of a rope swing in the Pocket area into the Sacramento River. I live in the Delta now. I love it. But I think you can still care about the Delta and know that the Delta is worthy of protection if you don't live in the Delta and if you've never even been to the Delta. I've never been to the Amazon, but I know that it's worthy of protection, and I am going to be an advocate for that in the same way that I'm passionate about preserving the Delta and caring about these impacts. Next slide, please. The impacts to historical communities are significant. The whole basis for designating this as a national heritage area, a huge part of that depended on the unique character of communities like Locke and Hood, Cortland, historic communities. These will be disproportionately affected by the tunnel. The tunnel intakes you probably couldn't have chosen a more devastating location to site these intakes. There was really no effort to look at alternative locations in the Delta. Even if you assumed that the tunnel was a good idea that should go forward, should these intakes have been located in the place where they were likely to do maximum damage to the Delta community's culture and historic places? It's a good question, because the Delta fish experts actually had other locations in mind. And we'll be drilling down on that in our comments on the environmental impact report, but it's a good question to ask yourself, why here? And if you try to wrap your head around this idea of what 14 years of construction would be like, for many of us in Sacramento, we've seen just huge amounts of road construction over the last 5 years in my community in Lamb Park. They've replaced sewer lines, water lines. It's pretty disruptive. Even if it's just a couple weeks in your neighborhood, it's dirty, it's irksome. Imagine living in the Delta, and this goes on for a decade or more. Only worse, because when it's over, some of your neighbors and the businesses that you patronize aren't going to be there anymore because their land's been condemned, or they've simply haven't been able to weather the economic storm. So I think that's something to keep in mind when we think about what does 10 or more years of construction look like to the Delta communities. Next slide, please. You'll hear more about this, I'm sure, in our water quality presentation. Barbara Barragan-Perea talked about it, but the Delta also has health effects from air quality and water quality impacts associated with harmful algal blooms. It's a problem that we've become much more aware of as a community and society. But by removing a significant portion of the freshwater flows from the Delta in the northern Delta and reducing the amount of water that's available to flush the Delta channels, we're going to see more of these harmful algal blooms. And in this way, the tunnel really isn't solving a problem associated with climate change, but it's exacerbating a significant problem that we're already experiencing with climate change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it's not just construction. When it's done, the impacts don't end. We'll be seeing permanent impacts to water quality. We'll be seeing impacts to fisheries, to recreation, and of course, just the ongoing social and community and economic impacts in the Delta. Next slide, please.
All right, back to me. Thanks, Kelly. We're here to tell you that there are better alternatives, right? Maintaining the existing freshwater pathway. I was watching a presentation done by a professor from Berkeley, and she stated it like this: we live in a world defined by 19th century laws, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century problems. And so, you know, this thinking from the state that the tunnel is the only solution and this is what we have to do in order to protect ourselves just isn't true. You know, there are alternatives out there, and they've been working on those alternatives. And this freshwater pathway, you know, it's a combination of storage releases, operable barriers, and then, you know, preparing for the inevitable earthquake. And so, and or sea level rise, right? We know we're planning for those things. And so the way that it's been approached just so far is the wrong approach. We need to be able to engineer with nature. There are lots and lots of studies out there that are working with the landscape to help solve these problems and not use a tunnel. I think Supervisor Mashburn called it a straw. Great. That's exactly what this is. And so, you know, we are going to talk more about alternatives as we go into as we get further into the presentation. Next slide. And so what are some of the things that we've accomplished so far? You know, the studies and the committees that have been looking at this were concerned about an outage if a levee were to break in the Delta. Well, you know, that is just those years of outage and water supply just aren't true. And so, you know, they're looking at that, it's in their documents. And so, you know, again, 6 months, I think, is what I've started reading, where they're talking about an outage for the Delta if a levee were to break or an earthquake. We have the resources and the storage in south of Delta areas that will actually get us through this type of disaster. So, more needs to be done on alternatives. There needs to be a serious look from the state in order to look at this existing freshwater pathway alternative. And so we're hopeful to see that in the draft EIR that's coming out, but we won't hold our breath. Next slide.
Thanks, Ryan. So hopefully we've piqued your interest now, and you might be asking, where are we in this process and why now? And as you can see from the timeline that we've put up here, this is the time for the public to re-engage and the local agencies in and around the Delta and throughout the state in this process. The state is expected to release its draft environmental impact report anytime now this summer, and there'll be probably a couple month period for folks to review it. You can review it at any level you want, but the key is to engage and to comment and to let the decision makers know your thoughts. This is your chief opportunity now to weigh in on this process. And we encourage everyone to do this, to comment on the environmental documents and the merits of the project. There will be future opportunities, as you can see from the timeline. They need to secure water rights. They need to go through a federal environmental review process. There will be various touch points in the future, but sort of now it's the time. And there's a lot going on in the world right now, and it may be hard to wrap your head around how you can devote some time and energy to the Delta Tunnel with everything else that we're dealing with in our society, locally and nationally and internationally. But as I mentioned before, this is something that is really worth your time, and it doesn't take much to make your voice heard. So we encourage everyone to do that by participating in the CEQA and environmental process over the next few months. Next slide, please. There's another opportunity coming up to protect the Delta from the damage of the tunnel, and that's to the National Historic Preservation Act, which is a federal law that requires federal agencies that are approving a project, and in this case, the Army Corps of Engineers has to issue permits for the Delta tunnel intakes. And in doing that, they have to consider ways to avoid or reduce the damage to historic resources. And the Delta counties that are most affected directly by the tunnel construction are working with the Delta Protection Commission and some of the Indian tribes that are interested in the Delta to become what is called additional consulting parties as the Corps of Engineers is considering impacts to historic resources. So this is not a process that can stop the tunnel, but if the tunnel is approved, it will allow us to argue for the best possible protection for the Delta landscape from a variety of impacts. And this is not just the historic buildings and communities, but also the scenic routes, the historic farms, and other features to address just a variety of these damaging effects. The Delta Protection Commission has a newsletter to keep folks who are interested and informed about this. And you can go to the Delta Protection Commission website and learn how to get involved with them. And for all the reasons I said, I really encourage you to do so. Now it's the time. The Delta is worth your energy and attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Kelly, for an excellent overview. And I think for pointing out certainly some of the project impacts, but also I think some of the considerations. And as you said, it's a critical time, and certainly even some of the purpose for today's summit. So with that, again, we want to thank Kelly and Ryan for their presentation. Certainly, again, we heard from Barbara earlier about the environmental justice considerations. And now we're going to move to our panelists to hear about some of the other impacts. And again, as noted earlier, we have a very distinguished panel, folks who are expert in their areas of professional work, and I think are going to share information that'll be very useful to folks that are with us here today, and I think going forward. So with that, without any further ado, I'm going to turn to our first panelist, or actually a second panelist, but the first one here at the dais this morning. And that would be Dr. Jeffrey Michael, who's going to talk about the economic impacts. And again, someone who's spent a good deal of his career working on issues related to impacts of projects and researching the various aspects of that. So Dr. Michaels.
Thank you, Supervisor Natoli. My name is Dr. Jeff Michael. I'm Director of Public Policy Programs at University Pacific. I've been studying the economics of the Delta for 14 years now, so I've got a pretty good amount of experience in this area. Next slide, please. I'll talk about the outline. I'm going to make 3 primary points today. The first is to talk about jobs, because that's sort of the first thing that people talk about and when they talk about economic impact. So we'll deal with that up front. And then other economic impacts we'll deal with on 2 levels of geography. First is some overview comments on the how this impacts the Delta economy. And then also to talk about the statewide economic perspective. It's important that, you know, sometimes this project is portrayed as something that's essential for the state as a whole and, you know, needs to be done for the greater good. And the reality is that it doesn't stand up to that level of scrutiny. So we'll talk a little bit about what some of the statewide impacts are and why it's actually not a good deal for the state as a whole. So next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about jobs in context. This is a massive public works project. All public works projects create jobs. And when you're talking about a $20 billion project, it is undoubtedly going to create thousands of jobs and lots of work. When proponents of this project want to talk about or ask about economics, they generally lead with this job creation figures. Well, job creation, I've done this sort of work myself. You know, it's a legitimate thing to consider and to you know, and to quantify. It's not really the primary, should not be the primary focus for decision making. But let's take the jobs perspective just for a moment and recognize that all the alternatives that the supervisors and people will be talking about today are also projects that are going to create thousands of jobs. And so if we wanted to take this project and compare it to the alternative uses of resources by the state, we want to ask, is this actually an efficient or a good job producer? And the answer is no. When the Water Fix project was out and the job creation estimates of that were out there, yes, it was tens of thousands of jobs over decades, but it added up to 6 jobs per $1 million of public spending. This is actually one of the lowest job creation figures I've ever seen for public works projects. Most construction projects are in the neighborhood of 10, and some of the alternatives like conservation and other potential alternatives to this are well above that. Why is this an inefficient job creator? Well, the answer is on the next slide, and it is the tunnel boring machines. I put a picture of the tunnel boring machine on the next slide, because this is what most of the expenditures, or a significant amount of them, are going to, is this extreme. You're going to have several of these very large machines, 150 feet underneath the Delta, slowly sort of tunneling and putting the concrete in place. These machines are, I'm told that these would have to be imported, the technology, the labor, and the machines themselves. So you're spending billions of dollars on tunnel boring machines rather than the kind of spending that you would do on alternatives that would be sort of creating more local jobs. So the bottom line conclusion of that is if your objective is to create jobs, this actually isn't a good approach to be taking for the state. Now, that really shouldn't be the primary objective for economic analysis. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the impacts on the Delta economy at a high level. First, let's talk about short-run impacts. So let's advance 2 slides here. So there will be jobs created during the construction period. Many of those jobs will be held by outsiders. Some of them will be held by folks from the Delta. So, you know, there is some positive economic activity during the construction period. But it's important to note that there's a lot of economic disruption on the existing and ongoing businesses in the Delta as well. If we look at these Delta counties and we look at the way their economies have developed over time, particularly over the last 20 years, we've seen that these have become important hubs for transportation. Both the growth and income in these regions is primarily dominated by the growth in the logistics and goods movement industry, as well as commuting from the Delta regions into the Bay Area for higher paying jobs. The agriculture industry, we'll talk about that, is still an important, wonderful base of the economy. But if we look at what has grown and what's putting money into people's paychecks that live in the Delta communities, these are the areas that are growing. Out of over 360 metropolitan areas in the United States, Stockton is now #2 for its dependence on the logistics and goods movement industry, and is #1 in the nation for growth in that industry in the past decade. It's critical to the economy. Commuting is critical as well, moving from east to west. And so when you have these massive amounts of truck routes, congesting the transportation routes, damaging the transportation infrastructure that these communities have invested in, that has significant economic impacts. It prevents people from getting to work, to getting jobs. It prevents a farm from being able to operate efficiently and to do their work. And it impacts the competitiveness of the region for the logistics industry, sort of increasing their costs and disrupting their activities. So it's important to understand there's a lot of big potential harm to that. It also harms some of these historic and heritage type businesses and economies in the Delta. And I think Kelly mentioned that. We have disruptions to agricultural operations that I believe Russell will talk about in more detail later on. There's harms to recreational opportunities. We talk primarily about the truck trips, but there's barge trips and on-water activity. This is gonna be very disruptive, very noisy, and very harmful to the recreation-oriented businesses in the region. So, those are some of the short-run impacts on the Delta, that there's a whole host, and we haven't completely quantified these, but very large negative impacts that might offset some of the employment impacts. More important is to think about the long-run impacts in the Delta on the next slide. There's not many words on the next slide because the long-run impacts and benefits of the Delta are zero. And I think Kelly mentioned, having disruptive work done in your neighborhood, and sort of can be disruptive, but at the end of the day, you have infrastructure that's benefiting you and your community and your neighborhood. And this one, you've got 15 to 20 years of disruption in the Delta, and at the end, you have infrastructure that provides zero benefit to your community at the end of the day. So there's none, but there are significant risks of long-term economic benefits. One area that those stem from is water quality, which has impacts across all these agricultural, recreational, health, as well as municipal water supply users there. So a lot of risk to further worsen an already problematic water quality situation. I'm also concerned about the flood control because flood control, this is important as we deal with sea level rise, and even the flooding risks we have today are critical in the Delta. Investments that we make in flood control are better when we have more stakeholders involved supporting those investments. And so, if the water exporters build a system that protects them with it and pull themselves out of the system, there'll be less interested parties, and I believe could have negative impacts on flood control in the Delta, which could have significant economic impacts. Finally, let me talk about the statewide economic impacts and a little bit about the finance of the project. So this is the next slide and the one after that. So the statewide effects. This slide basically says that this project is not cost effective. This project has had financial problems all along. Some news reports have quantified these. Most news reports you see about it sort of focus on some of the political and the geographical constraints, but understand that going back to the Bay Delta conservation plans and the twin tunnels, there's never been a financially feasible a viable financial plan for this project because it really just doesn't pencil out very well. I did an analysis on the water fix, the twin tunnels, that found that the costs of the project were 4 times the benefits of the project if you followed the project as described in the environmental impact report. There has been some response from the state where they put out reports looking at the economics that have much larger water supplies than they have in their environmental impact report, which is an issue to watch if they do that again in the future. But even those studies found that it was challenging. And what's interesting is now that the project is sort of scaled down to a single tunnel, in large part due to financial problems, because the twin tunnels, a big part of the reason why that project went around was financial troubles. Those of us who analyzed the economics said there's no way that the agricultural agencies in the Central Valley can pay their fair share. It doesn't make sense, they can't afford it. And sure enough, in 2017, when it came time that those agencies had to start making commitments to pay for it, Westlands and the Central Valley project dropped out, which was predictable to people doing financial analysis of it. And that sort of created the process, I think the beginning of the end of the Water Fix project and its evolution to a smaller single tunnel project that sort of might primarily serve urban users. The problem with the single tunnel project is that it's actually less cost effective than the twin tunnel project. And that was documented repeatedly by the state during the twin tunnel process. In 2013, there was a proposal out there in 2013 that San Diego County Water Authority and some environmental groups had created what was known as a portfolio alternative, which was going to be a small single tunnel like we're looking at now and spending some more money on other things. Secretary of Natural Resources, Department of Water Resources analyzed that economically and said that, well, that's the only alternative we looked at that had a negative cost benefit for us. And it's just infeasible. So that's in writing in 2013 from their agency. In 2018, they, after Westlands pulled out and people start saying, well, maybe we need to downsize it, they looked at a staged approach. They found it less cost effective than two tunnels and negative and infeasible for agricultural users. The reason for that is that scaling down somewhat to one tunnel, it does reduce costs, but really not all that much. It does make it a more difficult system for them to operate. So I think we're all real curious about what the operations are going to look like in the EIR, particularly having to think about a number of agencies not participating in the project and how they're going to deal with that problem. But the reality is this is a project that sort of has been proven to be not cost effective in the past. It's going to have major financial problems. Now, some people say, why should you care about the financial problems if you're not the one paying for it? If there's a metropolitan water district that says that they'll pay for it, and I guess 62% of the board voted for the water fix. Interestingly, 38% voted against it, primarily for cost reasons in the past. Why should you care? Well, understand that when a project like this has big financial problems, it affects all the other aspects of the project as well. And so I'm going to mention two considerations here. One is equity. So the financing plans for this project consider that in order to finance it, if the agricultural users in the Central Valley are unable or unwilling to pay their share of costs, which I believe most of them will fall in that category, that urban water agencies will sort of step up and pay the costs and receive the water. So the financing plan could lead to a redistribution of water supplies out of the Central Valley of California and towards urban coastal areas. That's a serious equity issue that the state needs to deal with on a state level, particularly because those urban coastal areas have a lot more alternatives available to them for their water supplies in the future. The other issue is that the financial issues conflict directly with the environmental commitments that are made in the EIR and other projects. And so, a lot of environmental commitments are promises. We'll operate it in this way that's less harmful to the environment. We won't take too much water through the tunnels during times when it's harmful for the environment. When you have a project with financial problems and it's being paid for through water sales, you've said that's a very problematic situation, and it's created a lot of direct conflicts. We know that environmental promises in the Delta have repeatedly been broken when they run up against economic interests, and I think the risk of that is very high for this project as well. Finally, let's talk a little bit about those costs. I said going down to one tunnel doesn't save you a lot of money. So the next slide talks a little bit about what we know about cost estimates today for a single tunnel. So the next slide shows that the costs are rising and water demand is declining. So in 2017, the Department of Water Resources estimated a one tunnel alternative would cost $11.7 billion, which was less than their estimate at the time of the twin tunnels was $15 to $16 billion. So it was about 25% less for one tunnel instead of two. In 2020, a preliminary cost estimate came out at $15.9 billion. I think that's the one that's being referenced now as a $16 billion cost. We don't know what it is today, but we do know that construction costs have just skyrocketed in the past 2 years. So for most of the decades of the 2010s, the state has a construction cost index for public works is rising 2.5% to 3% a year. People have historically sort of penciled in 3% for increasing construction costs. Well, since 2020, in the past 2 years, the state's construction cost index has increased by 30%, or I believe 29.4% to be precise. So if we were just to apply that escalator to construction costs that we're well aware of is happening in the economy today to this figure, we're already above $20 billion on this conveyance. And I think it's safe to refer to it as $20 billion. In terms of the benefit side and the needs, also recognize that something else interesting has happened in the past 2 years. The state of California has seen its population decline for 2 years in a row after a lot of flat growth for that in the future. And the prospects for growth in the future are much, much, much lower than people were expecting a decade ago or more recently. So we have a situation where we have rapidly rising costs and demand that's not increasing. In fact, it's declining. So a flat population that's getting more efficient in their water use, fewer people to spread those costs over. And so the impacts on water bills and rates is going to be significantly higher than what people were talking about 5 or 10 years from now. So these are all important things to watch economically as we see more and more details on this plan. So my last slide is just a conclusion that runs over some of these points. Jobs, yes, we create them, but it's not a particularly good way to create jobs with public spending in the state of California. Delta economy is not benefited significantly by this in the short run and certainly harmed in the long run. And it's really not a good investment for the state. It has a lot of issues. But basically, it's not the return on investment is just not there. And the financial problems some of them are very difficult to solve and create a lot of other problems for equity and environmental impacts that people are talking about in other presentations. So with that, I will end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Michaels. We really appreciate your presentation and certainly your analysis ongoing as it relates to proposals for conveyance. With that then, and again, I would just remind those that are watching or here with us in person that we will attempt to get to some questions, but all those will be recorded and certainly we can respond as a follow-on. Recognize that we still have a good deal of presentations ahead of us and we're an hour in now. So with that, then we're going to go to our next panelist. And we're very pleased to have her join with us today. I know she introduced herself earlier. She's going to talk about some of the recreational impacts and aspects of what we're talking about here today. And that's Ms. Lenore Clark. So Lenore, we're going to turn to you via Zoom.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the people gathered here. And it's almost like I'm preaching to the choir, and it makes me feel good that recreationally there are other folks interested. And to piggyback on the presentation we just had, recreational boating as an American pastime and an economic engine creates $13 billion a year in manufacturing and supplies and sales and services and boating recreational spending. Boating creates 41,125 jobs in California, 2,820 small businesses in California, and there are 745,641 registered boats in California. And this goes on and on as the statistics show that boating is big business and will continue to be an opportunity for recreating in the Delta as long as the Delta remains viable for boating. But with the looming, whether we want to call it the water fix or whatever other iteration, we are opposed to that because it seriously impacts our access to over 1,000 miles of waterway in the Delta, and will for up to 13 years with gates and locks and safety issues that go along with that kind of construction. As was stated before, businesses in the Delta, both marinas, restaurants, boat service businesses, and others will be impacted by the construction of tunnels throughout the Delta. Outdoor recreation on the water contributes significantly to mental and physical well-being of the people that recreate on the Delta. The Delta, Save the Delta Alliance took a survey not too long ago, and one of the impacts was shown that the Rio Vista Bass Derby, where people come from all over, not only the California and the country and the world to the Delta, that derby and the surveyors said it would ruin the Delta's, their opportunity to be in the Delta. And all of this, both the cost of the infrastructure for the tunnels and the time that it's going to take, do nothing to add to the storage. I know it's already been said, but it does nothing to create any additional water, but instead we should be looking at opportunities to add additional storage capacity. As I mentioned before, personally, I live in Discovery Bay. I've lived here for over 30 years and seen the water quality in my bay continue to decline. We got a notice yesterday that we're experiencing our first real severe algal bloom of the season, in addition to other invasive species that are brought into a freshwater area by lack of water running through the Delta and the movement of that water, which contributes to our inability to be able to swim, fish, or boat in the Delta. And I won't belay my comments, but as boaters, we have a right to navigate the waters of not only the Delta, but California and the state. And a lot of this construction will impede upon our right to do that. I mentioned that there were safety concerns as the construction goes on. When they placed gates and locks up to see if they could affect the fresh water and the impending salt water coming into the Delta, the turbidity around those gates proved to be a safety hazard for boating. In addition to the fact that there has to be increased signage to show any kind of change in the navigation. Not only have I worked on the Franks Track issues that have come up with the tunneling, but I'm on the advisory committee for the National Heritage Area of the Delta. And it's considered to be not only a significant and most important estuary in North America, but it has global impact throughout the world. And I see that if we continue on this track, there are going to be some unintended consequences of mucking around with our estuary, and will have adverse effects for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore. We really appreciate you sharing with us some of the thoughts from the recreational and certainly safety perspective. And again, I know that your voice obviously reflects concerns of others as well. So thank you, and hopefully you'll be able to remain with us. We're going to try to get to some Q&A here before the end of the program.
I will.
Okay, very good. Okay, so next, moving down to our panel, we're pleased to have our next presenter representing agriculture, Russ Van Lobensel, he and his family are generational farmers in the Delta, and Russ is going to share with us some of the some of the impacts on agriculture. Russ?
Thank you, Supervisor Natoli. First slide, please. In 1876, my great-grandfather came to the Delta and began to reclaim land in the Cortland area. Today, my brother, my nephew, and his son farm some of the same land he did. Except for 4 years at Stanford and 3 years in the Army, I have lived in the Delta, and I've been farming there for 52 years. Currently, I'm the Secretary CFO of Amistad Ranches, Secretary CFO of Esperanza Enterprises, and have been a trustee of Reclamation District 744 for more than 40 years. During the analysis of the BDCP and the California Water Fix, I was the president of the Sacramento County Farm Bureau and chaired the Delta County Farm Bureau's Delta Caucus, which joined together the 5 Delta counties to protect, promote, and enhance the viability and resilience of Delta agriculture. Second slide, if you can find it. Thank you. The current proposed tunnel project will impact the lives of Delta people on many different levels. I've organized my comments around the following: personal impacts, Amistad Ranches impacts, and Delta agricultural impacts. Although there are 2 diversion sites being proposed for the tunnel project in the preferred alternative, there is actually a 3rd site that will be analyzed. And that site is approximately 1/4 mile south of Clarksburg, where I have lived for over 40 years. Impacts from noise, traffic, and dewatering will have tremendous and negative impacts on the community and could make living in Clarksburg nearly impossible. The same can be said for those who live in the community of Hood, which could be bracketed by 2 diversion sites, one to the north and one to the south. Next slide, please. With the exception of 1 or 2 common wells serving several residences, each residence in Clarksburg is served by a private well. Most wells are 150 to 200 feet deep in the same depth zone as the area that will be dewatered during construction of the tunnel project. It is unknown how underground aquifers will react to dewatering and whether or not the water supply for Clarksburg will be impacted, but it is definitely possible that Clarksburg water supply could be interrupted for up to 10 years or longer. and that the aquifer may be permanently damaged by dewatering. Construction of the impacts will involve massive amounts of noisy construction activities, including pile driving, truck traffic grading, and other construction-related noise. Certainly, these impacts will make living in Clarksburg, Hood, Cortland, and Walnut Grove, 4 of the Delta legacy communities, extremely difficult. Construction-related traffic will include thousands of truckloads of fill dirt to 2 diversion sites and the possible removal of millions of cubic yards of tunnel muck, making transportation around the North Delta very difficult. All of this traffic will occur on winding, narrow, very unforgiving 2-lane levee roads with minimal shoulders and no bike lanes. Minor collisions can become very serious or fatal and often occur. When a vehicle goes off the road, there's a 30-foot drop to either the river on one side or down to farmland on the other side. So most accidents are serious. Although Clarksburg, Cortland, and Walnut Grove have small grocery stores, most residents do their shopping in Sacramento, Elk Grove, or Galt. Driving is a condition of life in the Delta, and the inability to use the roads due to congestion or safety issues will make life intolerable, extremely difficult, or impossible. Next slide, please. Amistad Ranches grows grapes, corn, wheat, safflower, alfalfa, and tomatoes within Reclamation District 744, the site of the northernmost tunnel diversion site. The proposed intake will take land for staging and other associated tunnel operations. California Water Fix would have taken 250 acres of land that we farm. The conversion of agricultural land in that analysis was categorized as temporary to last only during the construction phase. However, those activities will likely temporarily last permanently. Can you imagine what it might take to return land to agricultural production after it has had muck piled 10 to 20 feet high on it, or heavy truck traffic for 10 to 15 years? In addition, adjacent land could be impacted by dewatering, altered drainage patterns, disrupted irrigation systems, dust, and negative impacts to the reclamation districts within which they operate. It's hard to imagine how agriculture operations could coexist with 10 years to 15 years of intense industrial activity. Transportation throughout the North Delta will become very difficult during the construction phase. Amistad Ranches moves employees, tractors, implements, and agricultural products on Delta roads every day. We're already experiencing congested commuter traffic patterns around Twin Cities Road, in Walnut Grove, and on the River Road between Hood and Freeport. 10 to 15 years of truck and other construction-related traffic will only make farming in the North Delta more and more difficult, maybe even impossible. Negative impacts associated with the proposed tunnel will also impact our employees. We employ 20 to 100 seasonal employees, and employees, if they cannot reach their job sites, they'll go look for work elsewhere, or they just won't work. And that will exacerbate a current labor shortage for labor-intensive crops such as pears and wine grapes. The negative impacts of the proposed project will not be limited just to people. All 3 proposed diversion sites are adjacent to Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. Every year, around September 15th, greater sandhill cranes arrive and roost in the refuge shallow water. Every morning and evening, they fly to adjacent agricultural lands to forage for food. Over the years, our cornfields have attracted and fed thousands of greater sandhill cranes, turning a portion of the land adjacent to the Stone Lakes National Wildlife Refuge into an industrial construction site will reduce and negatively impact the foraging habitat of these majestic birds. Next slide, please. County general plans value and protect Delta agricultural resources and recognize that agriculture is the foundation of the Delta's economy. The Delta Protection Act of 1992 describes the Delta as an agricultural region of great value and states that the primary zone should be protected from the intrusion of non-agricultural uses. This act created the Delta Protection Commission and directed it to create the Land Use Resource Management Plan, which has 5 land use policies which protect Delta agricultural resources. In addition, pursuant to the Delta Reform Act, the Delta Protection Commission prepared, and Dr. Michaels prepared, the Delta Economic Sustainability Study, which clearly shows that agriculture is the backbone of the Delta's economy. The Delta Reform Act established the co-equal goals of water supply reliability and ecosystem restoration and conditioned their achievement on a protection and enhancement of Delta resources to include agriculture. The proposed tunnel project will have tremendous effects on Delta agricultural resources. Next slide, please. The negative impacts will be caused by conversion of agricultural land to other uses, transportation issues, degraded water supply caused by changing flow patterns and intrusion of salt water into the Delta, and other negative impacts to infrastructure such as drainage, reclamation districts, and flood control. An analysis of BDCP and California Water Fix revealed 64 negative impacts to agricultural resources in the Delta, and 20 of those impacts were classified as significant and unavoidable. I expect this project will do about the same. In addition, questionable mitigation strategies such as the decision tree and adaptive management were proposed. Because the proposed tunnel project will break so many promises and assurances of the past, how can they expect us to trust them when it comes to mitigation? If this project is built, businesses that depend on agriculture will be forced to close, agricultural jobs will decrease, and the Delta economy will begin a downward spiral. The combined effects of this project will be devastating. Next slide, please. The more water that's taken from the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta, the more economic and environmental damage will occur. Over the last 2 decades, Delta outflow has been regulated to protect Delta water quality and natural resources, including agriculture. This tunnel project will reverse steps taken to protect the health of the Delta and its economy by providing the means to increase water exports, reduce Delta outflow, change Delta flow patterns, and increase saltwater intrusion. I am convinced that there are better, more affordable projects to advance water reliability for California, projects that will impact the supply-demand equation by reducing demand or increasing supply. Regional self-reliance and increased water storage are key to reliability for California's water future. Neither of these key elements is part of this project or considered. We should all be committed to ensuring that the Delta is protected and enhanced in accordance with the Delta Reform Act of 2009. Next slide, please. And to searching for solutions which will achieve the Delta Reform Act's co-equal goals without sacrificing the Delta. Thank you, Don.
Well, thank you, Russ, and for both your thoughtful and your thought-provoking comments, and for sharing some, very important considerations when it comes to agriculture and its importance, certainly to the Delta, but to our state and our nation. With that, then, we're going to move to our final panelists before we bring it to the supervisors to have some discussion about alternatives. And we're very fortunate this morning to have someone who, again, has spent a career working on water issues in the Delta and certainly in Northern and Central California, and going to talk about water quality here today. And that's Mr. John Herrick. John.
Thank you, Supervisor, and the County Coalition for inviting us here. I think in my defense, not being able to operate the microphone, that's because there's little colored dots here, and some of us are colorblind and really resent the world operating around different colors.
Green is red, red is green, right?
They're both say blurry nothing, but anyway, I think the way to start this out is to say everybody understands that the Delta is in crisis. There's a lot of problems going on. There's water quality. There are water quality problems. There are fishery issues, various issues. So let's distill down this question. Can a freshwater estuary be improved by having less freshwater flow through it? That's it. That's the end of the discussion. And if the world could vote on something like this, everybody would agree with that statement and we would do something other than the tunnel project. But that's not what we're doing. We're moving forward. So what is the goal if it's not to improve the Delta? The goal is to improve the reliability and or supply for exports. Now, the problem with that is it may be a valuable goal for people south of us or on the coasts. The problem with that is that's not the priority for the system. And the laws say that the projects have to provide for salinity protection in the Delta, water rights in the Delta, and an adequate supply for the Delta before you export. And there's another statute that says releases of water for export have to be coordinated to the greatest extent possible to meet those three goals I said. So if you build a tunnel that takes water from the reservoirs or excess flowed in the valley, and you put that in a tunnel that doesn't go through the Delta, you're directly in opposition to those laws I just quoted to you. So let me go back real quick. Historically, of course, we had differing flood events every year, or rain events every year, snow, waters flowed down the valley, the excess flow overflowed onto the land in the valley, and that water seeped back into the main channels as the season progressed. And so we actually had pretty good water quality, no humans, or very few humans, but pretty good water quality. And then development came along and we built dams for lots of good reasons. It's not that the dams are bad, but those dams then started interrupting the flows down into the valley floor and then into the Delta. And so the state was experiencing a crisis early in the last century of saltwater intrusion. And the saltwater intrusion was adversely affecting business, industry, and farming in the Delta. And so there was a lot of discussion and they decided that, well, we need to build a big system that traps water, helps flood protection, and maintains water quality in the Delta. Even back in the early 1900s, they were trying to maintain water quality in the Delta. So that's what the projects are supposed to do. However, the upstream dams, especially the projects, have now converted most fall and winters, early winters, into dry years. So historically, if there wasn't enough rainfall the prior season, and the Delta may have gotten worse water quality over time, the first freshets, the first storms of the season, which were fall or early winter, freshened the Delta. And Contra Costa Washer District did a nice analysis of that a few years ago and showed that. But the system is now geared towards decreasing water quality in the Delta. So it's the same thing on the San Joaquin River. Excuse me for boring you with too much background, but the same thing on the San Joaquin River. But in addition to that, we didn't just build dams on the San Joaquin. We built a dam on the San Joaquin that prevented downstream flow. So they built Friant, which has zero downstream obligations past the Mendota Pool. So none of the Friant water, the upper San Joaquin River water, reaches the Delta. Now, in addition to that, the farming in the valley south of us, my father ran a farm in the south of the valley and economically beneficial to the area, good for the communities. But farming in that basin south of us, south of the South Delta, because of the soils, it added salts to the river. And then we started the CVP, which added more salts because it took Delta water, which wasn't of bad quality, but it had a lot of salt in it because of the quantities, and they delivered it down there. So 15 years ago, the numbers are different now because we've had 2 droughts, but 15 years ago, there was upwards of 1 million tons of salt being delivered to the valley south of us, and between 400 and 600 million tons, 600,000 tons of salt entered the river and flowed downstream to the South Delta. I'm the South Delta, so we resent that a little bit. And the fight's been going on for 50 years trying to address that. Now, one more thing that deals with salt, because there are 2 salt issues here, which I'll mention when I wrap up this tirade. The export pumps of the projects in the Delta are down in my corner of the Delta, and they pull water towards them, right? I mean, that's how it works. When you turn on a pump, the water level drops, so other water flows towards that dropped area. So the pumps in the South Delta reroute the flows of the Delta. And so the Southern Delta channels flow backwards towards the pumps. And so we used to have a system where the San Joaquin River came up, the main stem, Old River, Middle River off Old River, Grant Line Canal off River. So we had 4 channels taking whatever's in the water, whether there's little salt or a lot of salt or other contaminants, and that flowed through the South Delta and out. Now we have pumps that reverse those and they all go to one place. And so guess what happens? The hundreds of thousands of tons of salt that the CVP puts into the river or causes to be put in the river goes into the South Delta and collects in one little corner. And son of a gun, we have water quality problems. So those are 2 different salt problems, right? We have one where the San Joaquin River is salting up the South Delta, and we have another where intrusion of salt from the west affects people like Mr. Van Lobensel's by increasing their salinity. So the tunnel is supposed to take water before it reaches the Delta. Now they sell that as, well, we're going to take excess flows. So when it's high water quality, we're going to take that water. Well, that's not true. Number one, it doesn't pencil out. And I'm not supposed to say these things, but the project does pencil out, Dr. Michael, if you cheat, right? So if you export the amount of water that they analyze, maybe there's some justification. There's not really, but in order to make it work, you have to take more water than that. And so what do? They take more water that they don't tell us. Well, they eventually told us because we had hearings for the water fix, and it turns out that the proposed operation of the twin tunnels included many summers. So that's not excess water when you're exporting water in the summers. So how do we analyze this? Well, we've done analyses before. We have to do it again when this next iteration comes out. And so they analyze it through models. There's a model called CalSim. It's at CalSim 2, it's a number. And that takes all the information from the Sacramento River and it calculates what they have to do, what they need to do, how much water is there, how much storage is there, all sorts of things. And it produces outputs, and it's not that they operate exactly according to that, but that's the guideline, and they see what's going on. They can analyze changes. In order to analyze the Delta itself, then they apply that data into a model called DSM-2, and that calculates what happens in the Delta, what happens to flows, quality, state, all sorts of things. The problem is, I'll get to models in a minute. The problem is CalSim 2 puts out monthly data, and DSM-2 puts out 15-minute increments of data. So they take a monthly data, they pound the square peg into the round hole of DSM-2, and it comes out with other data. Now, they take all that data. This is what they did at the water fix hearings, and they put it all together, and they turn the blender on puree, and then they take the results, and they say, look, on average, you guys are fine. There's no problem. Of course, that was a lie, too, because there are times when it doesn't look good according to their data. But averages don't tell you anything. Let me just ask you this. If somebody said the average arsenic in your drinking water is, on average, well below anything that'll kill you, don't you want to know about the times that it's above average? Because it could be 1,000 times what'll kill you if you've got 10 years of averages that make that down to nothing, right? Well, we took their data, other people did too, and calculated it. And when you break it out, there were months of impacts that the averages hid months of impacts where the water quality in the South Delta was 100 to 600 EC higher than it would have been without that. Now the standard is 700, okay? And so they were gonna double it. There were some months where it was 900 EC higher. Now that's their model. So when they tell you that they're gonna analyze it and it's gonna look like it's okay, they're not being truthful to you, because the only way to analyze it is with these tools that don't really work and produce results that they don't want you to know. They want you to know the average of those results. Now, it's even worse than that. DSM-2 is a model that says, okay, X amount of flow is moving here, little boxes of things, and it's this temperature, it's this flow, it's this quality, it's moving here, the tide comes in. Well, a lot of people in the water fix examine that. The model has all the channel morphology wrong because siltation is occurring in the South Delta. So siltation is turning out to be our #1 problem, but we're addressing that separately. So the model says in Middle River, you've got 10 feet of depth. That's what the model says. And so that means the tide comes in, the tide goes out, there's mixing, there's temperature, evaporation. You go out and do soundings of Middle River, and it's 2 feet deep or less. And so the model is calculating the temperature, quality, flow based on a volume that doesn't exist. So how do you analyze it if you have models that don't work? Well, you can't, right? You can't do it. It doesn't work. So how do we know that we can improve a freshwater estuary by taking fresh water out of it? Well, we know we can't. So whatever the models say, whatever they don't say, it's not going to work, right? And the specifics of how bad it harms you is being hidden by the proponents of the project. So this is a long discussion. I'm going to cut it off here. There's so much as part of this, but I want to leave you with the regulators aren't your friends. Now, I don't know if there's regulators here and I'm going to get in trouble, but the regulators aren't your friends because remember I told you one of the problems of salt is coming in from this ocean, right? Okay, so right now we're operating under a fudge, a temporary urgency change, which allows the water quality to be worse. And in the first drought, the second drought, two droughts ago, in 1 year, the State Water Resources Control Board had 8 urgency change petition changes to relax water quality standards. They relaxed the standards. So when times get tough, they don't apply the standards, so we're not protected by the rules. They just say, well, we excuse us. DWR and the Bureau have never been fined or punished for violating water quality standards. Never. The South Delta standards have never been enforced. One of them is being violated today as we speak, and it's not going to get any better. You know what the state board did for the South Delta standard because it kept being violated constantly? They permanently relaxed the standard. And I don't have time to tell you how they did that, but anyway, so you can't rely on somebody protecting your water quality because the system is geared towards maintaining some level of exports regardless of the rules or the impacts on other people. Now, I know that's nasty, and that's why they invite me because once in a while they want somebody nasty to say things so that they don't look as bad, but that's okay. So I want you to understand that the water quality situation in the Delta is going to get worse. It's not going to be protected. And if the people of California, which is mostly us, the Delta counties, if we're not banded together and we're not fighting this, they're going to slit our throats and dance happily upon our grave. So you don't hear too many speeches end with that phrase, but I'll end with that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. And certainly your last example brings visions of something not very pleasant. And I think certainly your work in this area, and I think work towards trying to bring truth to the process has been very, very important. So, and thank you for being a part of the panel. Thank you to all of our panelists. And again, we're going to do our best to get to at least a couple Q&As here. I'm going to turn to my colleagues and they're going to offer some comments. I think we've had the backdrop of what lies ahead and the potential damage and threat to not just a way of life, but to a real treasure, that being the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta and certainly Sassoon Marsh and the estuary itself. And I would just preface the comments that you're going to hear from my colleagues by saying that one of the things that the Delta Counties Coalition has worked long and hard at is to, I think, bring forward information that would provide alternatives to do that in a rational and reasonable way. And to really, I think, as you've heard from the panels this morning thus far, is to let the impacts and the truth be known as to not only what we think, but I think what the analysis, as you've heard, have provided relative to information that is documentable and certainly understandable. And, to sum that up, though, I think the irreparable harm, everlasting impacts to the Delta, to the counties which we all represent, but certainly recognizing this treasure, which is a part, obviously, of a statewide network of water movement, and certainly recognizing that the Delta is a very important place within that, and that, as we've said many times before, we believe solutions should be guided by the state policy, which is in law, to reduce reliance on the Delta, and to meet our future water supply needs using solutions that don't, again, as some said here this morning, sacrifice the Delta. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleagues. We're going to hear from Supervisors Wynn, Mitchoff, Villegas and Miller. And then we're going to come back to a call to action, take some Q&A, and try to keep us on schedule here. So with that, to my right, Supervisor Wynn from San Joaquin County. Chuck.
Thank you, Don. I always appreciate John's comments. John and I serve on some water boards, and I would say John is always consistent. So I appreciate that, but I also appreciate his honesty. I'm going to shorten my presentation and just cover a couple of things in regards to alternatives. And I would say one thing that that we hear a lot about is in regards to our water availability. And the fact of the matter is that this state does not suffer from the lack of water. It suffers from the lack of infrastructure. And I say that because in California, we receive about 150 to about 300 million acre feet of rainfall every year. Now, obviously, a lot of that goes into the ground, a lot of it goes into other projects, et cetera, but a lot of it also goes into the ocean. And the problem is that for whatever reason, back in the 80s, for example, we had some water projects, especially storage projects, which were terminated. And that was part of the overall plan that was in place for decades in regards to providing water for this, for our residents, beyond obviously where we are now. Unfortunately, currently, we have a challenge in regards to the single tunnel. And I would say, unfortunately, I don't think from a political standpoint, because whether it be the governor, the government administration, the state departments, they're pretty well, set on their path, and they're not going to change. What I have found, though, in members of this Delta County's Coalition, fellow supervisors, we have traveled the state and talked to other players in regards to the water situation, and whether it be in San Diego County Water Authority, whether it be Santa Clara, whether it be a meeting about 4 years ago with Mayor Garcetti in the city of Los Angeles, which I found his comments, especially from his created water cabinet. And I'm sure you're familiar with his first goal is to reduce the importing of external water supplies by 50% by 2025 and by hopefully 100% by 2050. I bring that up because he had a whole toolbox of ideas in regards to providing, whether it be stormwater capture, whether it be desalination, whether it be recycling. There's a whole host of things. And I think that, his creativity and his vision, I think, are something that we can all look at. There are a lot of projects throughout the state, and it's kind of been touched upon, but the fact of the matter is, as opposed to investing in one location, we can build a whole bunch of projects. It was talked about, Dr. Michael talked about the twin tunnels. Back when one of the arguments against the single tunnel as opposed to the existing proposal of the twin tunnels was, well, you need two of them because one may break or be damaged or whatever, or need to be cleaned. So there was a real resistance to that by saying you can't do one tunnel because it's not feasible and it won't protect the water supply. So anyway, all those things added together. I have a list of just projects that run from Northern California to Mexico on water projects that are probably the best solution to our water problem, because if something happens, and not just the tunnel in the future or even our levees currently, we have the opportunity to continue to operate. The aqueduct, for example, has some problems in regards to subsidence, which has reduced the maximum capacity to about 80% of the flows. And the same applies to the Friant Kern Canal in regards to its problems as far as its ability to flow. So I bring this up because I believe that the solution to really make California maybe a world-class water state is to build these projects which create local jobs and local benefit, and most importantly, local control. And if one breaks, there's others around that can obviously be used to supplement. So I leave that to my colleagues, but I truly believe that in my dealing with the Valley counties, my dealing with the mountain counties, and certainly the Delta counties, I will tell you this, that I have found no one that I've talked to that disagrees with the premise that we do need to do local projects as opposed to the single tunnel. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Chuck, and well said, and appreciate your comments. So we're going to move to Supervisor Mitchoff from Contra Costa County. Karen?
Thank you. And I am also going to deviate a little bit from my comments since most of the issues relative to how we could better use taxpayer funds elsewhere have been stated. I did want to state for the record, I noticed early on that Contra Costa County was not part of the video. And if you've noticed me typing here, it's because I wanted to know why. And so in the future, Contra Costa County not only supports my colleagues and my sister counties, but it will be fully participating in any future video. And that is not a criticism of staff here, but I'm most upset that they were not represented. It's interesting this morning, and you'll notice a lot of us probably have our little county seal buttons on. And when I went to get ready and walk out the door, I pulled my jacket out of the closet and I thought, oh, there's already a pin on there. I should take that off. Well, you can't read it, but what it says is she persisted. And I thought I'm leaving this on today because we are going to continue persisting in the issue of fighting any through Delta Tunnel project. I had a little PTSD, maybe some of you did too, when I heard the terms BDCP and water fix today. Maybe it's COVID and we've not been gathered, but I just shuddered because it brought back not good memories. And this is 2022, the 40th anniversary of the referendum that prohibited the peripheral canal. And so I'm wrapping all that into this persistence that we need to continue persisting and resisting any through Delta project. And with that, Mr. Chair, thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. And we know that Contra Costa certainly has stood tall and certainly shoulder to shoulder with all the counties. And again, thank you for your comments and certainly for your ongoing work throughout your years on the Board of Supervisors and certainly a part of Delta County's coalition. Okay, with that, we're going to turn to Supervisor Villegas from Yolo County.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll also keep it brief. So as you can tell from the previous speakers, it's pretty clear the Delta conveyance isn't the answer to California's water problems. The DCC, as you know, understands the challenges and the need for deliveries throughout California. And we've actually toured Southern California. It's actually quite incredible to see firsthand the advanced technology being used to conserve and to be self-sustainable as they are in Southern California. But as been noted, isolated conveyance cannot guarantee one single drop of new water, not one, and you've heard that already. And the demand for water is only going to increase. We know that. If you're paying any attention at all to the conversation around climate change, the challenges will persist and the demand will increase. California needs a long-term resilient water portfolio, and an approach that incorporates resiliency is essential. For statewide water solutions to succeed, all of those impacted must be considered and included as part of the conversation, including the legacy communities in the Delta. Any tunnel option that would harm the environment and the economy, any tunnel option would harm the environment and the economy. Yet far superior alternatives have already been discussed here today and have been mentioned. We believe that locally based projects that the DCC proposes will produce more reliable water. Local projects which promote self-reliance is a better alternative, and it's time to shift the water paradigm. So I think I'll just jump into very quickly the two components of our call to action before we get to the final speakers. So there are two things that we're asking many of you to consider because many of you know that this can be daunting by itself, but all voices need to be heard. So there's two things to consider. Number one, adopt a template resolution that we've drafted that's available to you. If you go to savingthedelta.net, there's a draft resolution we put together that's got some language, incorporates kind of the principles that we've talked about here today. You can alter it, modify it in any way you feel necessary, but certainly adopting it raises the elevation, the level of the conversation around this issue. And then you can also consider writing an editorial that suits your concerns and addresses the needs that you have relative to the project as we've discussed here today. So 2 things to consider. Hopefully you'll consider both of them, but if not, at least just one. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Oscar. And again, thank you for laying out the call to action. And with that, I want to go to Supervisor Miller from San Joaquin County. And just would note to Supervisor Mashburn's here at the dais. He didn't plan to speak, but certainly you're welcome to following Kathy if you'd like to, Mitch, make any comments, and then we're going to bring it back. So good. Kathy.
Thank you. And a couple of false narratives that have been put forward by various proponents of an isolated conveyance. And we've heard a little bit about some of them. One of them is, well, we have to do a tunnel. The status quo is not acceptable. Nobody's arguing for that. We have consistently advocated for a multitude of regional projects that would provide for regional reliability, sustainability, local jobs, local control, local operation, and multi-benefits to the regions where these projects are constructed. So the status quo, nobody's arguing for that. We all know it. The type of projects we have been advocating for include stormwater and wastewater treatment, recapture, and recharging of aquifers. We've talked about a multitude of groundwater recharge projects. In my county alone, we have the capacity of Folsom Lake in our aquifer that could be recharged and used in dry years. Conservation, people will tell you another false narrative. Oh, they're just saying conservation is the answer. Nobody's saying conservation can do it alone, but conservation is a key part of making this state's water supply self-reliant. Above ground storage, nobody's proposing any wild projects, but what we have consistently advocated for is looking at expansion of existing reservoirs. That's very doable. It's much more cost effective. We've also looked at a wide variety of other local projects that will actually increase our state's water supply, which is really what we need to provide for dry year supply. So another false narrative that has been put forward over and over is, well, we have to do an isolated conveyance because all the levees in the Delta might fail if there's a massive earthquake. Well, if that's really a threat, then why hasn't the state used existing taxpayer dollars that are there and available to upgrade and improve the existing levee system in the Delta? They haven't done it because they want to keep using this threat to make people believe that an isolated conveyance is the only answer to safety. It isn't. So the key component that this coalition has advocated for over a decade now, very successfully, is it is wrong for our state to advocate for a project that pits one part of our state against another. And it is time for California to unite around good, solid, sustainable water projects that solve our supply issue instead of dividing us. We are all Californians. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Well said. Mitch, would like Supervisor Mashburn from Solano County.
Thank you, Chair. And I don't have a prepared statement, but I would like to say something very quickly. Just to bring it all back around for everybody, I want to remind everybody out there that the Delta is a place and it's a people, and we have a history and we have a future. And what we're talking about here with the conveyance system, which is, I will also remind everybody, just infrastructure. It's just infrastructure to move a very finite resource. We only got so much of it. And no matter how big you build your pump, you're still going to have a very finite resource that we're all squabbling over. And the creation of that infrastructure is, as was eloquently stated earlier, the death of that place, those people, that history, and our future. And if we don't come together as a state and work our differences out and create policies that increase that resource rather than create fights over it, we're going to destroy all of it. These proposed this proposed tunnel will cause irreparable damage, not just to economies and not just to places in the Delta. It will cause irreparable damage to the environment as well. It will cause salination in our aquifers. It will cause a change in the environment in the bay. It will permanently eradicate some species in the area of the bay. It will permanently affect our children and their health in the bay and the Delta, but also in California. I just want to bring us all back around to that, and I want to make sure we're all focused on the need to come together as a state and create a greater supply before we worry about how we're going to convey that. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor Mashburn. I'm going to then bring it back and make a comment here, and then maybe we can take just a couple of questions. I know we're just right at the 11 o'clock hour, but I think what you've heard, obviously, today from the panel and from my colleagues representing, as I said earlier, more than 4 million people here in California. We see ourselves as being certainly a part of this great state, and we want to be a part of the solution, but not be the sacrifice and treat the Delta as a treasure, which it is. It's a national heritage area, and as my colleagues have very aptly said, and others, there are so many attributes that are not only worth saving, but worth, I think, enhancing. And that's what the law says. And so treat us like the treasure, not like a plumbing fixture. I think that's what we're asking. And we want to be a part of that solution. And we've advocated that now for well over a decade. So bringing it back, and I will, before we close, certainly express some thank yous, and I'll ask Oscar to give the call to action one more time in a moment. But Natasha Drain, who's the coordinator for the Delta Counties Coalition, she's joined by very capable staff support from all 5 counties in her efforts. And she's been fielding the questions. And so why don't we try to take 2 or 3? Again, we knew we were going to be short on time, but maybe there are a couple that capture. And while you've got this panel assembled, before we dismiss everyone, let's see if we can't take a couple of those, Natasha. So I'm going to turn it to you.
Thanks, Supervisor. The first question is, have the Delta counties been successful in discussions with the state and SWP contractors about mitigating transportation impacts to road surfaces and levees underneath?
I can take that. So in a word, no. I think so far we haven't had any commitments about mitigation, and we'll be looking to see what the environmental impact report includes on that point. But I'll just note that over the last couple of years, there was a so-called stakeholder engagement committee process that the the state water contractor proponents, in conjunction with Department of Water Resources, put on to hear from Delta residents about their concerns. And there were some tweaks that were made to the project that had the benefit of addressing some concerns about access and transportation, but it was really just tinkering around the edges, and the changes weren't made to address concerns of Delta residents. And make no mistake, they were made because the independent technical review panel that was hired by the state to look at the feasibility of what they previously approved told them it was essentially unbuildable. So those design changes weren't made in response to Delta resident concerns.
Thanks, Kelly.
The next question Can you tell us what percentage this proposed diversion of water reflects as a total percentage of water that moves through the Delta in its current state?
Okay.
I'll take that one again. No, because they won't tell us. So we don't know yet. Well, we're looking to, again, to the document that's coming out. And I think this reinforces what we said earlier in the presentation, why everyone needs to take a hard look at these documents when they come out, because so far the operations, which are critical for understanding so many of the impacts, the water operations to folks in the Delta, have been shrouded in mystery. But I will say, and John Herrick might chime in here with some additional detail. In the prior version, there were times when the project could divert half of the flow of the Sacramento River. And just to go to Mr. Herrick's point about, is it a good idea to take fresh water out of the Delta that's already experiencing water quality problems? I think that common sense can tell you that taking any water is of a north in the Delta is a concern, but half the flow of the Delta of the river would be extremely problematic.
Let me add to that. That's correct. It's not a question of the percentage we're taking out. It's a question of how much is coming out at what time. So if you want to take 3,000 CFS when there's 5 million acre feet flowing through the Delta every day because of a flood, nobody cares. But that's not what the plan is. And so if you're going to take 3,000 CFS when it's a dry time, the standards aren't being met, and you get a temporary urgency change petition that says, yeah, that's okay, it's not going to hurt anybody. That's the problem.
Very good. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, John. We'll take 2 more questions and then we're going to wrap it. So,
have the counties or Jeff done an analysis of job loss in each Delta County if local projects such as schools, hospital, roads, et cetera, cannot move forward due to air quality restrictions if the tunnel project is using up all available air credits? Dr. Michael?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific analysis of that, but actually that's an excellent detailed comment, because we do see air quality restrictions. There are challenges in these communities, and increasingly this is an issue for a lot of projects. And so if we have a project like this that has significant air quality impacts, it's going to make it more challenging for other local projects. So that's an important area to look into.
Great. Thank you. The project costs due to construction are increasing. Who will be paying for the project if some or most water contractors are not?
Go ahead.
I'll take that. We heard that earlier. If the water contractors either can't or won't pick up the added costs, the plan is for urban ratepayers to pick up the cost. So that means for a whole lot of Californians, the cost for their water is going to become astronomically expensive. Somebody has to pay for it.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Okay. Go ahead. I'll let you kind of gauge this, but if you got a couple other questions, I know we're running long, but go ahead.
I wanted to make one comment because there were several comments from attendees asking about how they could participate in the comment process. And what we'll do is on the savingthedelta.net website, include information about how individuals and organizations can participate in that process. So I want to make sure everyone knows that. Okay. And then we also have one individual, Joseph Rizzi, in the chambers today that had requested to address the panel.
Okay, very quickly, Mr. Rizzi, if you're here, we got going to give you a quick minute because we're up against time. But
my quick minute is I'd like to try to advocate for Delta louvers. It's basically putting the Delta on a saltwater diet. What you have and what you don't always realize is the fact that we have dredging that is done every year. And by doing that, you are making channels from the ocean to the ports of Sacramento and to the port of Stockton. You are driving the water, which is heavier than your fresh water, and it's coming in, and you're trying to push more fresh water in to try to push it back. Your real problem is in your channels. If you put these louvers in there, which are a temporary structure, they have a base, 20-ton concrete slabs to hold up the louvers. and it's all marine grade. So it's very cheap and inexpensive. You're talking about around $100 million. You put it in these 3 locations. I have a flyer here, which I have given to some of the people. This is an easy fix. And I know people don't understand that it shouldn't be that easy of a fix. If you don't import the water into the Sacramento and into the Delta by trying to get the water to go to the ports of ports of Stockton and Sacramento, you don't have your problem. But you're also saving the Delta because the Delta becomes more of a freshwater area. All of your concerns about fish, boating, all have been addressed in here if you have a chance to look at it. I'll be happy to give these flyers out to any of you, and I would love to do a larger presentation if that's available.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rizzi, for being here, for sharing that. And we want to thank all of our folks that have submitted questions and certainly stuck with us throughout the morning presentation here. So I'm going to bring it back to Oscar to do the call to action one more time, and then I'm going to concluding comments and offer some thanks, and then we're going to call it a morning. So, Oscar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I mentioned earlier, just another reminder, there are 2 things you can do. If you are in support of kind of the concepts and principles that we've discussed here and the alternatives that have been discussed, number 1, adopt a resolution. Again, if you go to savingthedelta.net, there's a sample resolution there, and you can certainly tweak it to your liking and make sure that it accommodates the concerns or questions or the issues that you have. Or you can write an editorial either to your local paper or the social media outlets that you use, making sure that your concerns are shared with the public. So,
okay, thank you, Oscar. Let me ask my colleagues and panelists here, was there any last comments you wanted to make that we couldn't bypass? And if not, then I'm going to say thank you certainly to the clerk's office here in Sacramento County for their assistance, to Natasha Drain, the Delta County's coalition, all of our staff and counties, to those who helped to put the video and the presentation here together today. For all of you that have tuned in and will be watching this in real time, but those that may view this afterwards, I think I want to bring it back to the point that there will be an environmental document issued later this summer that relates to much of what this morning's focus was on. This summit was put on to hopefully provide information and opportunities for folks to gain further understanding information, certainly from the perspective of those who would be most directly affected in many cases. And to, I think, advocate for alternatives that would, work to provide for long-term reliability and sustainability for the water future of this state, but certainly of the Delta, and not bring the focus down to a conveyance that for now the past 40 years, this in one form or the other we've been talking about. And so with that, I want to thank everyone. Natasha, was anyone I neglected to thank for your participation, for your ongoing work in this regard. And we look forward to the opportunity to work together, just as the 5 counties have now for many years, to advocate and serve as a voice for the Delta, but also to serve as a voice for an irrational and logical approaches to addressing the long-term needs for a state of 40 million people. So with that, I'm going to bring it to a conclusion. Express thanks to everyone once again, and I wish you all a good Friday, and we look forward to further outreach in the months to come. Thank you so very much.